Hi, good morning, afternoon, evening. This is Dr. Frehiwot again. Welcome to week 4 of Intro to African American Studies. So this week, I thought I would focus on week 3 and week 4 since I didn't give you a video for week 3. And so I think I just want to kind of take us through a little bit of a journey. When we look at the readings and material for week 3, we see a large focus on sort of the end of slavery, right? And so the end of slavery is often sort of pinned or coined around Emancipation Proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, which theoretically freed slaves. But it freed slaves, particular slaves, right? Particular class of slaves. So it didn't free enslaved Africans who were still on the plantation. They had to, free themselves. They had to really escape slavery to then find sort of the opposing camp military to then hopefully be taken in by them and then be sort of declared freed people of African descent. So that's sort of a first sort of fallacy that we have about the Emancipation Proclamation, is that it actually freed the slaves. It didn't necessarily do that. And then, of course, the Civil War, sort of the impact of the Civil War on the institution of slavery also must be sort of addressed, because the Civil War really was a fight over economics, right? So it wasn't really a fight over the, humanity of African people. It wasn't really a fight over the brutal treatment of enslaved Africans. It wasn't really a fight over, ideology around whether slavery was a just system or whether slavery was an unjust system. It was really a fight over economics. It was a fight over the South sort of controlling the economy through the slave system, right? And so when you look at it from that perspective, then you realize that the fight was even a fight really not even about enslaved Africans, but it was really about the country sort of clinging to this archaic system of slavery to push economic control in the South. So I think that's really particularly significant about, last week's reading, is that the Civil War, oftentimes touted as sort of the, quintessential moment in U.S. American history that freed the slaves, and the Emancipation Proclamation also being sort of that, legal document, which then, pushed slavery, the question of slavery to the fore. And I think that approach and that analysis is unfortunately very narrow, because it doesn't take into consideration the political, the economic, and the social impact of the slave trade in America. It doesn't take into effect that the American economy was definitely an export economy, but it was also an economy that was very agrarian. It doesn't take into account the fact that you had, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people working for free and toiling land for free. Where are you going to get those bodies from when slavery when slavery was, abolished, right? So this is really what people in the South were fighting for. Who are you going to get to, till the cotton fields, the cocoa fields? Who are you going to get to till the sugar cane? Who's going to, look after the children in the big house? Who's all of these sort of key elements that, surround this Civil War and this concept of the economy of slavery, right? Then you, of course, have the political implications of freeing slaves. Because when you think about the freedom of enslaved people, when you free enslaved people, what you tend to do is you realize a couple of things. You realize that when you free people who have been enslaved, they're going to want some retribution. They're going to want some reparations. So how do you compensate them for being enslaved for over 300, 400 years? How do you ensure that people who are enslaved still have housing? Do you kick them off the plantation? What type of representation do they have politically in the legislature? Who is representing those individuals who have been enslaved? How will they eat on a regular basis? And then most importantly, I think it was the ideological mindset that, African people were meant to be enslaved, right? And this is a mindset, an ideology, which we know is a set of principles that guide our behavior and actions, right? Is dictated by the ruling class. And who was the ruling class at the time? The ruling class was sort of a European elite group of folks who were pushing the narrative that slavery was predicated on not just the need for free labor, but on the need to civilize people of African descent. And there was a hierarchy, right? An invisible and a visible hierarchy that existed in American politics. And then, of course, there's the social implications. White European slave owners, I'm sure, were fearful for their lives. You begin to free enslaved Africans, what ends up happening? Are they going to come and kill us? Are they going to take over our plantations? Because theoretically, they had outnumbered, right? Enslaved Africans, people of African descent in the Americas they were outnumbering those Europeans. So the question becomes, from a cultural perspective and even from a socio-economic perspective, you had some white slave owners that were fearful for their life. And so then when we begin to sort of transition from the Emancipation Proclamation and sort of the abolishment of slavery, we then see a different type of discrimination that comes along. We see this concept of 40 acres and a mule, which was in force for 1 year and then was rolled back by Johnson, right? And then that in itself set back people of African descent generations upon generations. Can you imagine if people of African descent had 40 acres of land and a mule to till, to work, the conditions that people of African descent would be in today, economically, politically, and socially? There perhaps would be inheritance that was passed down from generation to generation. There would be, better schools, right? There would be better access to employment. There's a wide variety of things that would happen. The playing field would be equal. And so that in itself, really was a critical blow to people of African descent and the evolution and their evolution post the abolition of slavery. Then I think that when we begin to look at this concept of, Jim Crow and how Jim Crow and segregation really impacted people of African descent. And when we say Jim Crow, we're really talking about a separate but equal system. We're talking about a system that, ultimately said that African people weren't good enough to sit at a lunch counter with people of European descent. We're talking about a system where, African people had to go to different schools. We're talking about a system where, African people could be lynched for looking at a white woman. We're talking about a system where there was lynchings that were running so rampant that, people would come, as Dr. Henry Louis Gates said, for over 50 miles to witness a lynching with picnic baskets in tow. Like, can you imagine going, gathering your children and going on a trip to watch a lynching of another human being? I mean, how do you rationalize that, in your mind as a human? But it's rationalized because the ideology of society dictates that these people are not people at all, but they're less than. You're better than them. They're no better than the cattle that you slaughter at, cookout, or the goat that you slaughter at a cookout. And so here's where, this more psychological oppression and mental oppression and economic oppression comes to really put the hammer down on people of African descent. Henry Louis Gates talked about Mr. Moss, the gentleman who had a food co-op in Memphis and was attacked by a mob of white people in the community because he was performing well. Him and some of his comrades, fought back against this mob. Would you do the same? Several of the European people who fought, against him and initiated this mob were injured. No one was killed, but they were injured. Mr. Moss and his, comrades were subsequently arrested and put in jail, but ultimately broken out of jail by the mob and then killed on the train tracks. How does that work? If someone is, quote unquote, pursuing the American dream by opening up a food co-op, giving people of African descent a place to actually purchase food because they can't do it in white establishments, but you now are trying to run them out of business or you kill them on the railroad tracks because they're defending themselves. So this is really this concept of hypocrisy sort of in American culture around people of African descent. And then when we think about even the Memphis situation, when we look at Ida B. Wells and Ida B. Wells's role as a key, civil rights a key, anti-slavery activist. She herself was run out of Memphis because of her, newspaper, and because of the journalism that she practiced, downing, lynchings, which anybody in their right mind would down the lynching of another human being. So the question becomes, how come systematically, because ultimately lynchings were legal systematically, right? How come systematically lynchings were legal? Here are some of the questions we need to ask ourselves. And then as we, transition, beyond sort of the stage of lynchings and this concept of separate but equal, we also, witnessed a couple of key other pieces. Is this what they call the Great Migration, right? So you have many people of African descent, families, individuals, et cetera, going north. So many people may ask, well, how did my family get to California, or, to Oregon, or, to other places in the north, or south, I'm sorry. How did they get there? Not south, I'm sorry. Going towards California, not north. California is not necessarily north, it's west, I'm sorry. So many people were traveling west to, get away from the harsh and brutal conditions that they found in the south. There were no jobs. There was no access to quality housing. There was access to lynchings. There was access to your children going to separate but equal schools. There was, access to, your children being killed for looking at a white woman, specifically if your child was a boy, right? A young boy child. We all know about Emmett Till. There was definitely opportunities for you to have to step off of a curb if you were a grown man and you saw white people coming. You would have to step off the curb and allow them to pass. There was, economic, political, and social repression in the South. And so many families decided, I'm going to go west to try to find a different life. And the question becomes, did they find a different life? Because in those places, while there were the life was not as severe, the country was still a country that was predicated on the slave system. And nations and states in the West and in the North and in the South and in the East were all byproducts of the slave system. And so many of these folks who went out west, and even to the New Yorks and North and et cetera, were also faced with discrimination, specifically when they were coming in and they were taking jobs for lesser wages, because they would be paid less, work more than their European counterparts. And so that in itself caused a major friction between poor working class Europeans and people of African descent who were migrating from the South. Now, I'm not sure if that narrative sounds familiar today, because we have this very similar narrative about people who are immigrants in the U.S., whether they have papers or don't have papers. There is a sort of narrative being painted that they are taking the jobs of African people, of low-income whites, of even immigrants who came to the country 20 years ago, first or second generation immigrants. There's this narrative that they are taking the jobs of U.S. citizens. Does it sound familiar? Because it sounds very familiar to me. It sounds like the same type of narrative that was pushed during slavery, when people of African descent migrated west. So let's think about sort of this narrative. Is the narrative sort of continuing from a different perspective, but it's the same narrative? So is this, U.S. system still predicated on these age-old notions of segregation and humanity, some sort of invisible hierarchy of humanity? Here are the questions we need to ask. Do we, judge our place in the system based on our relationship to the white hegemonic power structure? Ask yourself that. And if you don't know what white hegemonic power structure is, look it up. It's a very deep position, specifically called on or discussed in the critical race theory. So as we look at the migration, one of the other key things, I'm going to go back a bit, is this concept of self-empowerment, right? And people of African descent said, listen, we're going to build all black towns, and those all black towns are going to ultimately meet the needs of our people. And they did meet the needs of the people for a considerable amount of time. Of course, that was until they got burned down. Or of course, that was until the people got run out of the towns due to violence. So the question becomes, were people of African descent put in a catch-22? You can't integrate into the current system, and you can't make your own system. So what system are we supposed to integrate in? How will we eat? And then, of course, we've got the Marcus Garvey situation. We know the great Marcus Garvey, the founder of the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, who we saw had a Black Star Line shipping company, and he was going to ship, African people back to Africa. And along with the shipping company, he had many other companies. They had a newspaper, they had over 1 million members in the UNIA, and they were interested in organizing to stop the oppression of African people. And he said that every African, whether you're from Harlem or Haiti, or whether you're from, Johannesburg, or you're from Brazil, or you are an African. Every descendant of Africa is an African. And so he recognized the connection between Africa, the African continent, land and power, and African people in the U.S. And so when we really begin to think about slavery, this period, Jim Crow, segregation, there's a couple of, emerging themes we see. One, we see an emerging theme of sort of a fight for economic, political, and social control of America by the government, but really this sort of Eurocentric power structure, right? Which was reinforced by American policy, right? Then you've got on the other end of the coin, you've got people of African descent who are saying, listen, we're going to take matters into our own hands, and we're going to manage our own affairs, as Kwame Nkrumah says, the first president of Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence in 1957. We're going to manage our own affairs. So we're going to start our own towns. We're going to, start our own schools, like Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. As we're gonna, as Booker T. Washington did. We're going to go to the Harvard universities, as W.B. Du Bois did, and we're going to get degrees. We're going to go, and at Howard University, the premier institution for people of African descent during that time. And quite frankly, it is one of the best HBCUs today. I mean, perhaps I am a little biased because I am a Howard University alumni, but I'm just saying. Howard University's law school really became the mecca of, civil rights cases being fought against the Supreme Court, with, of course, Thurgood Marshall coming out of that law school and really arguing the Brown versus Board of Education on the heels of Mr. Charles Houston, one of the deans of the law school, right? So how do we look at this in context today? We see a couple of things. We see some of the systematic challenges that still exist. We see segregation. It may not be outright, but we see it. We see people of African descent in segregated communities. We see unemployment ridiculously high. We see the separate but equal education. And if you don't believe me, go into any community school in the quote unquote, inner city, and then go to any school in the suburbs and ensure that the population of people of African descent or people of color is high in the inner city school. And go to a school where you find the majority of people of European descent and just identify the resources they have. Identify the quality of their teachers. Identify the graduation rates. We'll find that separate but equal is still in place. And so the question becomes, as we continue to look throughout this class at African people, and really, the intro to African American studies, but more importantly, the role that African people have played in the, evolution of and building of the United States of America, as well as the world, we have to make some critical decisions, and we have to critically analyze sort of the way forward. We have to recognize that it has not always been a rosy road, and we have to take into consideration sort of the impact of the slave trade and the impact of Jim Crow and segregation and separate but equal on African people today. And the question I would raise for you is, how has slavery, the impact of slavery, transcended from generation to generation? And how is it impacting people of African descent today? The other question I would raise is, ideologically, do we believe that America is farther along than we were during the slave trade? And then what are the changes ideologically? Do we see overt changes, or do we see covert? Do we see open or closed changes? And then lastly, how do we take this information and use it to, not just educate the next generation, but also to, influence the way that we think and the way that we view the world, and the way that we view each other, because ultimately we're all humans. So we must take this information and use it to not just personally benefit, but also to professionally benefit and to benefit academically, and recognize that it's definitely very significant, and it impacts the way that we view the world today, and it impacts the systems that we are currently living under. Thanks. Look forward to chatting with you next week. Again, congratulations on getting to week 4, halfway through the semester. You can do it. Looking forward to your comments. Take care.